Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoresea.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, we explore the depth and breadth of theology, part 1. There's a depth and a breadth to theology that I've not experienced before otherwise. And I find it fascinating. It just overwhelms me. I think of the Eastern Orthodox movement and how they describe the spiritual gifts. For instance, the gift of tongues. They see that, and it matches so well with the Pentecostal and charismatic movement, I guess, in the sense that, at least at its outset, they kind of describe that gift, the gift of tongues, as understood by the Pentecostal movement or the charismatic movement, as like an induction. It's an introduction. It's kind of like you experience this gift initially, and how Paul describes it in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 13 and 14 is it's a lesser gift. It's an introductory gift, maybe, to try to introduce one to the gifts and try to understand what's happening. One speaks in tongues, and it needs interpretation. And when one speaks in tongues, one's understanding is not necessarily edified, but it's one's spirit speaking directly in communion, in a sense, to God. And that's a fascinating thing to think about for a while. But eventually you can either grieve the Spirit or you can fall out of the Spirit where the gift of tongues kind of loses that resonance. As we talk about participation, it kind of ceases to hold its power. And so Paul, in a sense, is saying that, desire tongues is great and gifts, but desire more to prophesy. Desire a greater maturity, where in that maturity that you would seek to allow the Spirit to move in your thinking as well, and move beyond just speaking in tongues where nothing is understood by anyone, including the one speaking in tongues, unless there's some form of interpretation, to moving to something where the Spirit of God and the mind and soul, the one Spirit, all commune together, where that same thing can take place in a sense like prophecy, where one can speak and one participates more. When I think about initially my upbringing and and I don't believe this is necessarily directly related to my parents or my family itself. It's just the people I had surrounded myself with. I began to be drawn to this more fundamental Christian aspect, whereby in that extreme fundamentalism, I was in my own echo chamber, and I got to the point where what I did understand, what I did know, what I thought I knew was all my way of thinking was right. And if you did not agree with me, you were wrong. And I would vehemently argue with you to the point that I didn't really listen to what you had to say. No matter what you said, it didn't matter, because what I had to say had to be right. And it was very rarely could someone speak to me, mean something to me, because anyone else, any other voice was always wrong. And unless you were willing to agree with me and further the conversation, and really, to be honest, I was so selfish back then that I did not even really want to listen to someone that agreed with me. I wanted to listen to myself. I was that selfish. I had begun my studies, and I was in the undergrad, and I pulled out because I just could not sync with academia. And I felt like I was choosing the spiritual side of things, and I felt like I was choosing to listen to the voice of the Spirit more than to listen to anyone else. And it ended up largely being private interpretation. And so that's what I, largely did. I would read, and that at some point I'd even shifted over because of the fundamental movement I was with to the King James Version of the Bible, and I would read it, and then whatever I thought I understood it to say, that's what God said. And then if it resonated with my life in some sense, then I would believe God had spoken to me, and that private interpretation applied to me directly in the moment. But those traditions and those understandings that were outside of me, I disdained, I vehemently argued, I put them down as much as possible. And anyone who did not hold to what I thought about then, I pretty much was a pain to them, would not listen to them, and would, ridicule them, make them the butt of jokes and everything. And I found myself drawn to the types of people of which I was, or, that type of person that I was. I was drawn to those and would get underneath them, and they would, tell me what the right way to read the Bible was, and I would agree with them, and I would believe it. And I found myself under two interesting individuals that, they believed so strongly in the Bible, and this is what it means, and I would then believe it wholeheartedly, swallow it, and then I would go into the depths of whatever they said and would, dig it out, ferret it out, and find, this, yes, this is what I'd see. And both of them were quite amazed, and it was interesting because I could be very encouraging to them as yes men, and they would say something, and then I would figure out a way to find that in the scriptures to such a depth, and that would even amaze them. And it's like, looking back now, it was almost as if, they were shocked and surprised that what they said had actually really meant anything. And it's scary because they would just espouse something and not really know necessarily if it was true or not, and I would take it as God's gospel truth and would then find a way in the scriptures to make it stick. And then they would be amazed, and then I would, whenever they would move to a different way of thinking, they found it very difficult because I was so deeply entrenched in what they had said, that they found it hard to move away from that when they wanted to do something else to justify some new belief. And, they were very flighty. And I, see how, much of the church has been flighty and unable to, stick to something. They just go from one fad to the next, and, there's no depth. And so that's a lot of what has happened in the church. You have the original church that was birthed, after the New Testament and has depth. And, then you have the Protestant Reformation, where there's a key breaking of that. And then it just splintered into so many different pieces down through the centuries since the Protestant Reformation, and then even those pieces have broken down, and we had at some point in our history denominations, and then we lost even that. And we've become either, I guess the original terminology was interdenominational, or it became non-denominational, and I really don't know what we have today. It's just a free-for-all. And fundamentalism as an echo chamber has created this idea that I'm trying to figure out exactly how to say it, what I see now from what I came from. They create an echo chamber into what is, and everything else is not. This is God's gospel truth, and this is the way you must read the Bible, and you cannot read it any other way. And then when someone leaves that type of a movement, I only see two other trajectories that one would take after leaving such a thing. So if one leaves that type of an echo chamber, usually then everything else is wrong, because to enter into that echo chamber is to be, in a sense, almost brainwashed to the fact that this is the only reading of the text possible. And there's only one truth, and that's the truth that this echo chamber is espousing. And we begin to eliminate everything else off the list as possibilities. It cannot be this. And it becomes almost to an extent of what we're not. We're not this and we're not that. So we end up just being what? We end up being, this is not what we are. We're not this, we're not that, we're not this, we're not that. And you can delete all of these things from the list. And none of these are the truth. And this is what we are. And we minimalize our understanding to being so, it's a black and white, and we're the white, and everything else is black, and there's nothing else. And we have to work very hard to make sure that people understand what we are and what we're not. And there's so much that we're not. And this is just what we are. And then, in a sense, we paint ourselves in a corner, and eventually people that kind of leave that, then leave the entire thing of Christianity, because they believe that Christianity is just a small little thing. Or, when we leave, like myself, we begin to see that maybe all those things that we said were not are worth listening to now. And we get that, as I began this talk, we get more breadth and we get more depth. It's much more nuanced, and it's amazing that we find so many things that correlate. As an example of the former, I'd like to put it this way. In the post-Enlightenment period, human thinking began to get more scientific and less theological, less mythical, less spiritual, maybe I should say. And so we begin to think the ancient people were very primitive, and, they didn't wear clothes that much, and they weren't very cultured or sophisticated. They were very, antiquated and very simplistic, and we begin to believe that they could not do much. And we begin to narrow things down to the point that we say we are monotheists. And so as monotheists, we just believe in one God. And so we limit ourselves to, our theology is only the belief in one God. And we do, in a sense, have the Trinity, but there are some versions of this that, are not even that are that do not espouse the Trinity, that there's still only one God. And so, and we have seen how people have used this to espouse this idea of a movement or an evolution of God's people in the past, from polytheism to monotheism. And we really failed when we did that, because we removed everything off the table except one God. There is no other gods that ever existed. Everything else in the supernatural or spiritual world is, what is it? Fairy tales. It's lies. It's nothing. And we begin to narrow our vision. So we kind of pull up out of the ground and we become very shallow, the opposite of depth, and we begin to, again, put those blinders like a horse wears, and we cannot see any more depth. We have no depth of vision, and we have no breadth in our theology, and we become very simplistic as fundamentalists, and we begin to rule out so many things that we are not, that what we are becomes very shallow and loses its meaning. And if you think of the parable of the sower that Jesus talks about, we're becoming very shallow and easy for people to fall away. And so people become atheists in the post-Enlightenment age rather easily or readily, because atheists, as is pointed out by some, is I hold to one less God than you do. In other words, you deleted all the pieces off the board, and I took the final piece, and now there is nothing on the board, because the same logic you use to get to monotheism, that the existence that there is only one spiritual being, and it all started with, well, I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to be right and correct and precise by trying to focus my attention on the one true God, meaning that all the other gods are false, meaning they don't exist. And then the next step is to use that same logic that then even that God doesn't exist in the post-enlightenment thought. And so that's where we ended up. And so when we get into this echo chamber and we stop understanding, facets of Scripture, what they mean, one of the dangers I see, and I've discussed this over and over again on the broadcast and some of those older videos that I pulled from the archives. I have no problem with Christ-centered preaching, I guess, or Christ-centered teaching, but if it gets to the point where Jesus is the focus and that Jesus Christ is on every page of the Bible, then it gets out of hand, because I think that's just like monotheism. We begin to lose any breadth or depth in what the Bible was actually teaching, and we begin to lose our focus. And so I understand having vision difficulties. My eyes have given me much problem as of late, and I've lost focus, and my vision has become blurry, and it's very difficult for me to see, and because of it. And so I begin to see how we lose that breadth and we lose that depth and the richness of God's truth when we as Christians then take, Genesis chapter 1 to be about the Trinity and about Jesus. And we focus on teaching the Pentateuch. Everything in the Pentateuch is merely only about Christ. And if we cannot preach Christ, then, because Paul said, I will only preach Christ and Him crucified. And we lose all the depth. We lose all the breadth of what is actually happening in the Pentateuch. And we just, as much as I spent just doing a series on participation and speaking of repetition and speaking of prophecy in the earlier videos and all of that, there's nothing wrong with, yes, what the New Testament writers do with that to explain the coming of Jesus, and I agree with all that as a Christian. But I think it's oversimplified to the point that it becomes very shallow, and it's very dangerous. And I'm told, for instance, that the fundamental movement and, some aspects of that has caused people to get so shallow that it has no depth, it has no breadth, that they fall away. And they can move easily from monotheistic position to an atheistic position. Really easy and really simply. They can make that jump so easily in a post-enlightened world that postmodernism, in some sense, is revisiting those things and going back while trying to push the vision forward and say that, no, that's not true. And so that's what I feel like I have done, is that I've left this fundamental idea, being highly fundamental, ultra-conservative, if that means being evangelistic in that sense means only a very shallow, I can cook it down, the entire Bible down to one simple sentence or one simple thing, that it becomes so simple and that I just repeat that what begins to happen is a reversal in the sense of when Jesus turned water into wine, we turn the wine into water by watering it down. That when life's challenges come and those storms come, that if I build my house on this type of sand, that this is simply the message of the Bible, and it ends up being that sand and not the true rock, and I lose my breadth and I lose my depth of perception, and it only becomes the childlike faith of a simple proclamation, and I only see the story of Jesus on every page, and I'm not allowing it to speak to the more mature aspects, then it can get dangerous. So obviously, when we explore many different aspects of the Christian traditions that exist, we're going to find many points of commonality. And, there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with the gospel as presented in that sense. But what I'm getting at is I think that there are more levels of commonality that when investigated will cause people to understand that we're actually trying to say the same thing in a lot of the differences that we seem to see on the surface level. But when we dig down deeper, they're just expressing the same things in different ways, but it's still the same message. And I want to get that depth. And so I'm resonating now more with the other traditions because I'm actually listening to them, and I'm finding out that they are saying the same thing that I believed and the same truth, just in a way that's a little bit different, and it's fascinating and wonderful. And so it's worth enjoying and worth evaluating it for what it has to say. And it's actually helping me in some blind spots that I had, so that I can see better now and that I can do better, because they are thinking of things I didn't think of. And because they are, I'm grateful for their voice, because they're doing things that I'm not gifted at doing, and they're expressing it in ways that I didn't think of. And so it's fascinating and wonderful all at the same time. So we hope you enjoyed part 1, and we want you to join us in part 2 as we continue the dialogue. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.